GZERO's coverage continues. A fun fact, by the way, Davos is the highest elevated town in all of Europe. So our heads are already in the clouds, so I figured why don't we talk about space a little bit and how it's increasingly becoming a critical domain for great power. And Ariel Ekblaw is the founder of Aurelia Institute. You focus on exactly those kinds of issues.
Indeed,
yes.
Exactly right.
Welcome to Global Stage
Thank
and
you,
to
Tony.
Davos. It's great to see you and meet
Great
you
to be here.
So I was thinking about this, and really there have been like two moments in my life I can think of when the average person really geeked out on space. When I was a kid, space camp was a big deal.
Yeah.
Everybody wanted to be an astronaut. More recently, commercial space travel, Blue Origin, SpaceX. That's not really what we're talking about here. Why don't you explain the premise?
So what I did for my MIT PhD, thinking about the future of scaling up life in space, is to develop these modular tiles that autonomously snap together when they're floating in orbit. So if anybody has kids that play with magnet tiles, or you remember Legos from your childhood, imagine that paradigm for building really massive infrastructure in orbit. And the reason we're so excited about this is it lets us build things that are bigger than our biggest rocket payload fairing.
So you're talking about using space as a place to manufacture, to actually build structures.
Exactly.
And so give me an example right now of how the things that are happening up in space are impacting life on Earth.
Three great examples of what really massive scale infrastructure in space could unlock. The first is AI data centers in space. If we want to get that carbon footprint off of the Earth, it's not the technically easiest thing to do. The whole idea that space is cold and it helps them cool, that's a little bit of a misnomer, but there are other advantages like raw, unfiltered sunlight. Second example, really massive scale building, space-based solar power. Get raw, unfiltered sunlight from orbit, beam it down to Earth 24/7, and fundamentally solve the intermittency problem for solar power anywhere on the world. And the third, and my personal favorite, is we need architecture, human architecture, space habitats in orbit that could be much, much larger than your rocket. So the technology, Tesserae, that we've spun out of MIT, now going forward is Rendezvous Robotics, will enable things like massive orbital biolabs, where you can do biology when you're floating in a way that you cannot do on Earth, work on cancer treatments, artificial retinas that would cure blindness, really amazing therapeutics for the future, all for the benefit of life on Earth.
How close are we to these things? Are they happening right now? Are we 5? Are we 10 years?
They're happening right now. There's massive Silicon Valley investment in space-based solar power. Big firms like Sequoia or A16Z, NEA are already involved. AI data centers is a big debate about whether we want them in space or not, but that conversation is already happening. And the biology in space has actually been done for 20 years by NASA, but just in small scale academic experiments. Now what we want to do at Aurelia Institute and at Rendezvous Robotics is really scale that up profoundly to have factories in space.
The data center issue is actually really interesting because many nations want them and also don't want them at the same time. But what would be a disadvantage to having it in space, for example?
One of the challenges is space is a vacuum. There's no air. So there's no way to do what we call convective cooling, to have air go around the electronics and take the heat away. You can only do heat with radiative transfer. That's kind of inefficient. And so it is hard to get rid of the heat off of the data centers. That's one of the challenges. But if your alternative is it's hard to get permitting on the Earth and there's a water burden and a grid burden in these local towns, there may be an argument for going to space and using that raw, unfiltered sunlight when you're above the clouds to get more efficient powering for that architecture. But it's definitely a trade-off. It's not purely simple.
GZERO talks about geopolitics.
Yes.
So, and we're here in Davos, by the way. We talk about great power competition. We mean land, we mean sea, of course, increasingly cyberspace and technology.
Right.
How does space play a role?
Space is really critical in this new domain. It is essentially the ultimate high ground. So we saw geopolitics in the Cold War between the US and Soviets really drive kind of the first era of a rush of space development. We're now seeing a similar space race with China. So a lot of activity on the Chinese space sector. Difficult for the Western world to sometimes collaborate with them because their space work is traditionally tied to their military. They don't have as robust of a civilian space program like European Space Agency or NASA. But there's definitely an interest now really growing in a geopolitical tension. One of the most fascinating things is that NASA now has a taxi to the moon. It's called the CLPS program, Commercial Lunar Payload Services, and that is meaning that it's almost more of a focus on commercial companies now driving this activity for this new era, not just military, defense, and government.
So I was going to ask you about that. So you mentioned the US versus the Soviet Union, Apollo versus Sputnik.
Yes.
We're really talking more about private sector enterprises here. How does that change the geopolitical game and who owns the spaces that we're talking about?
It really matters for space policy, how we govern things like launch, who has liability and from whence you have launched or from where you have launched. It matters about how we think about the moon. The Outer Space Treaty of 1967 needs some updating. I think it'd be really fantastic to be able to do a conference of the parties, kind of like we do within the climate realm for updating treaties. There's a huge need for things like this, just new tools to be able to help commercial endeavors have the confidence as a CEO to say, I can invest in this activity for helium-3 mining on the moon, and I know that there's a legal framework that protects my ownership rights to what I've extracted. The US has begun to do this with tools like the Artemis Accords, but we're really just getting started in defining this landscape.
So it's funny, I'm thinking about the real world debate that's happening right now here in Davos over Greenland,
Yes.
right? And the struggle between Europe and President Trump over who should own Greenland.
Yeah.
Who owns the moon? Is there a conversation happening about whether or not geopolitical competition in space actually leads to ownership of space?
I think the reality is there's so much science fiction that assumes that space becomes a utopian, spacefaring society. The reality is we will bring our human foibles with us and some of our geopolitical tensions to space. But the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, which is still abided by the US and the Russians, very, very clearly states you cannot own a celestial body. The trick is that you might be able to own resources that you take off of a celestial body. So there's a very interesting nuance there to be kind of sussed out in the coming decades. But for now, there is still geopolitical agreement on there is no pure ownership of the moon.
So finally, we are in Davos. You've got leaders of all sectors gathered here.
Yeah.
What do you think they should be focused on right now to make sure that 5 to 10 years from now, this is not creating geopolitical crisis?
Yes. I think one of the biggest focus areas that we should have as a series of nations is space for Earth. What are the infrastructure plays like orbital biolabs, AI data centers, energy from space that really profoundly benefit their citizens on a day-by-day level? We know about GPS, we know about telecom that are space-based, but if leaders can invest in their own companies and countries from their own nation states in this next wave of technology that benefits their citizens, I think we'll have a peaceful and a very fruitful use of outer space going forward.
Ariel Ekblaw, that was terrific. Thanks so much for stopping by.
It's an honor to be here. Thank you.
Thank you.